And she'll be speaking on Nova Scotia watershed assessment.
Thank you. So how many people here are familiar with Nova Scotia? I know we've got, wow, that's pretty impressive. Great, okay, well I'll still show you lots of maps to orient those who have not been to Nova Scotia, but I'm excited to talk to you today about a case study. So this is going to be an experience discussion, not theoretical, not academic. I'm an academic, but my field of research is really in global climate change, global water cycle, and also in monitoring water quality in real time. But I've embarked upon this case study as a sort of as a necessity when I arrived in Nova Scotia, so I'll be talking to you about that. What I'll be talking to you about today is the Nova Scotia Watershed Assessment Program, and which began in December 2010, which I took part in initiating. And so it's based out of Dalhousie and also teamed primarily with Nova Scotia Environment and Department of Natural Resources. But it's an interesting case study that raises some theoretical questions that we've been talking about today, so I'll be drawing upon those as well. So when I arrived in Nova Scotia almost 3 years ago, I was surprised at many different things. I'm originally from British Columbia, fairly relatively wealthy province when in terms of money for studying water resources. And the first thing I was surprised at was that acidification is still a real major issue in Nova Scotia. Originally, Nova Scotia was one of the hardest hit areas by acid rain. The pHs were the lowest among Europe and Eastern Canada and the United States. And the recent studies have shown from these long-term Environment Canada monitoring programs, I hope they will preserve, but they've shown last year that the pH has not increased in the rivers of Nova Scotia, although it has in Europe and elsewhere, but this is really a unique hotspot. And the waters are still toxic to aquatic life, and we're having new data on aluminum levels that are very high, which are toxic. We have these acidic episodes that we're collecting data on with our real-time data, and also there's a bit of a crisis in terms of calcium for both forest ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems, so the calcium is too low for these ecosystems. And another unique thing about Nova Scotia is they still have wild Atlantic salmon populations, but they are at a crisis time right now. Last year, one population in the Inner Bay of Fundy has been declared endangered, and in 2010, COSAWIC, which is the Commission on the Endangered Status of Wildlife in Canada, recommended that pretty much the rest of the Nova Scotian wild salmon population be declared endangered. So that's been in review by the Species at Risk Act this spring, so they're still making that decision on whether to make it officially endangered. So, but this brings up questions also with resilience, where these systems are going. Another big surprise I had when I arrived is that there's a really, as Ashley was speaking to yesterday, there's a really active community watershed involvement, especially in collecting information, which is great, but that is reflective of a bit of a large gap in terms of the capacity of the government to do this job. They really don't have the resources and they haven't been doing it. So, but as a result, we are lacking a big picture. So we have all these community groups and small watersheds doing what they can to sort of react to crises that they see, but there's no big picture for the problems. And then I started looking at the watershed data as I wanted to get some baseline data for my research as a hydrologist, and I found, first of all, that the watersheds weren't defined hydrologically. They weren't really watersheds, so there was some confusion there, and that the stream network data really wasn't worked out yet. The streams are flowing different directions, and Nova Scotia, you know, if that happened in BC, that would be really shocking, and it was a bit, but in Nova Scotia, the watershed boundaries are a bit vague. It's flat terrain, there's wetlands, and it's not really clear which way the water is going, so just keep that in mind. And also we found that there's been some studies done, as we find elsewhere, but they're stored on individual desktops and in different government agencies, and that really needed to be brought together. So it's like, okay, if something has to be done, we have to get a provincial scale picture on the status of the watersheds, some baseline information, and get some information on what are the pattern of watershed problems in Nova Scotia, which watersheds should we be allocating resources to and which not. And there's a new need to assign priority watersheds. One example that was also surprising to me was that when I arrived, they didn't know where the dams were in Nova Scotia. There's a long history of dams, 200 years of dams being constructed, and there wasn't an inventory available. So that was an obvious thing that needed to be done as well, because some of these obviously block fish passage, right? So there was in 2010, I don't know if this was copying the Water for Life policy document from Alberta, but the Nova Scotia Environment launched their own version of Water for Life. And so we sort of tagged onto this to try and get some funding to start a watershed assessment project in Nova Scotia. And linking onto this action, that there's one of the priority actions was to engage with post-secondary and community groups in order to improve knowledge about water-related issues across the province. And my background before I went into the global water land surface modeling, I worked in BC for the 1990s during the heyday of forest renewal BC. I don't know how many people remember forest renewal BC, right? But it was pretty cool. And there was a great process with coastal watershed assessment procedures, CWAPs, and interior watershed assessment procedures, IWAPs. We produced these report cards and sort of collected all the fundamental baseline information for the watersheds, and were able to make some priority decisions. That's a strategy procedure. So this was part of my perspective. And we established some goals for the watershed assessment procedure, simply to begin to address simple but high-level questions for watershed management in Nova Scotia. Just what is the state of watershed health in Nova Scotia, to begin to understand this question, which watersheds are most impacted in which scenarios, what are the key problems, and also we want to know what information we have on the watersheds and what information is missing, so based on stuff. And as Karen was speaking to yesterday, this really is essentially a high level of analysis, so in terms of your policy framework, more of a strategic focus. So we began this assessment in 2011 in January, and we have a preliminary phase, which we had about 8 months of time to do. We had a small budget of $25,000, which we could basically hire one really good GIS technician and work for 8 months. So that's really what I'll be speaking of today, the results of that part, and then we've got a new round of funding, so we've had some time to reflect, talk with community groups, and look at the next stage of this, what we're calling a Part A, this preliminary assessment. Should be pointing at the screen, there you go. And then we hope that this will motivate some more informed actions for future assessments. Another thing we don't have is water budgets. We don't know available water in Nova Scotia. So that's one thing we need to do, obviously, and have the Part A will enable more question-driven assessments that are more expensive, that require collecting of additional information and filling gaps. So the first step was to redefine watersheds, and this is what we started with. This has been the working watershed map for Nova Scotia for the past decades. And as you see, this isn't actually a watershed, but this is the Halifax area, right? So we had to sort of re-educate people, what is a watershed, and we came up with just some watershed boundaries based on digital elevation models, very simply. And you'll see an interesting pattern of Nova Scotia, right? There's not one big watershed. There's a lot of small watersheds in Nova Scotia, which is interesting. We get to the question of why do we know so little about water in Nova Scotia? Questions of resilience too, which I'll allude to later. And for the purposes of this first phase, the 6 months, what we did, we couldn't analyze every small watershed. We instead defined the major watersheds in each of. We still had to deal with that primary watershed, his legacy of other maps. So what we were able to negotiate was, okay, let's define the largest real watershed in that framework, and then analyze those first, and then we have the residuals as well, coastal areas, and then we'll look at the smaller secondary watersheds in the next phase. So, and our GIS technician worked very hard in gathering geospatial data. So not time series data, but geospatial, something that's, the criteria was that the data covered the entire province. So we could use these indicators just to do an overview assessment, right? And various agencies were great. There were wonderful participation from Environment Canada. I think I left out DFO here, but there's Department of Natural Resources, Dalhousie, Environment Canada. And these are such as just anthropogenic land use maps that we collected. One useful one from Environment Canada was produced by Tom Clare, which is showing the sensitivity of the land to acid precipitation. So after we collected all this geospatial data, we began to wanted to get, okay, what information can we gather at this broad scale, and we wanted to get a better picture of risks to values of such as hydrologic change, so water availability, flooding, right? In-stream habitat loss, so this is more riparian area threats, riparian areas. Water quality issues, which relate obviously to acidification, but in the more agricultural areas, there's problems that you encounter more here with nitrogen and phosphorus and turbidity. And it's related risk for surface erosion. And then we have another value of terrestrial ecosystems. So this is more the forests and natural ecosystems outside of the actual water channels themselves. And from this, once we gathered all the geospatial data, we were able to see, okay, what information can we gather from this? And we were able to come up with just 11 simple indices to evaluate the watersheds. One is